Assalamu alaikum, everyone. This is Murtaza Khwaja. I'm the Legal and Policy Director with CARE Georgia. Thank you for joining us for our first ever Care for a series. Today, we're having our first ever Care for a talk or Care for a convo. And we're very lucky to be joined with Emery Wright, who is the co-director of Project South. Emery is a civil rights activist and is an Atlanta native. He's done some incredible work with Project South. Emery, thanks for joining us. We're really glad to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Murtaza. It's great to be here and really honored to be here with CARE Georgia.
Thank you so much. And we're really thrilled to have you. Project South has been one of our closest partners, both at the legislature and in a lot of our advocacy work. We've worked closely with them. Priyanka, who's their staff attorney, as well as Adade Shashahani, who's also a director there as well. So we're really lucky to have this relationship with Project South, and we're really lucky to have you here. Emery, a lot of our viewers are aware of the work that Project South is doing. Do you mind just sharing a little bit of the history of the organization? I know you've been in this work for a long time. What work you all do, and sort of what your projects are, and all the spheres that you touch.
Thank you so much. And again, just such an honor to be here. And we really value our organizational partnership with CARE Georgia, as you were mentioned. And I just wanted to also recognize the new executive director of CARE Georgia, Abdullah Jabber, and all of the team at CARE Georgia. Just thank you all so much for putting on this forum and for all the work you do. And also, I just wanted to, before I really get into explaining some of the background of Project South, just thank you all for tuning in on Zoom, on Facebook Live, on YouTube. I think it's so critical that we are here together participating in a conversation about breaking down alternatives to the police and ultimately for Project South, abolishing the police. You know, being a part of this conversation, everybody has a busy schedule. We all have other things we could be doing. But on one hand, with everything that's going on in the country right now, if you're joining this call and you don't identify as being part of the Black community, your participation in this call to me is an act of solidarity with the Black community, because as we're all aware, there has been some unprecedented uprisings by especially young people of all race and religious and ethnic backgrounds, really to defend and protect Black life, and under this banner that we also all know, Black Lives Matter. But also for all of us, I just think, regardless again of our background, being a part of these conversations is really a critical part of our democracy. And so just big respect to CARE Georgia again. We have to wrestle with these very challenging questions in order to build the type of society that we want to live in, that we want our children to live in. And so just thank you, thank you, thank you. Project South was founded in 1986. We were founded by civil rights veterans and labor organizers who really wanted to build an educational arm of the Southern freedom movement back at that time in 86. We were coming just off of the historic civil rights movement. A lot of the problems that we were working on as a movement in the 1960s and 1970s were being sort of rolled back on by the Reagan administration at the time, and very similar parallels to some of the moves from this current administration we're seeing, where rollback on basic civil rights, on basic human rights, are happening from the top down. And so I bring that up just because I think we were founded in a similar moment to the moment we're in now. We do a lot of community organizing in our local neighborhood. We really have an emphasis on youth and youth development in our local organizing. We're about to start our 12th annual Septima Clark Community Power Institute for high school students this summer as a summer youth leadership development program. And for movement building, we really believe all social movements need to start locally. And so our local work in South Atlanta, where this brother Rayshard Brooks was just killed by the police happened, we're in the same neighborhood. Our neighborhood's been transformed into almost feels like a war zone.
I do want to take a moment just to honor Rayshard Brooks, honor his life. A lot of times we use these names and they become hashtags. And I understand the movement there, but this was a 27-year-old man who's a father of three. He was going to his daughter's 8th birthday party the next day. He was a hard worker. From all accounts that we've heard, we've been told he has an infectious smile. He enjoyed his life. He cared about his family, and his life should not have been taken away from him. And we're going to talk a little bit about Project South's work in direct response to what happened with Rayshard Brooks. But I do want to honor his memory right now, and I do want to, give his story the due. This was a young man whose life and dreams were cut far too short, and it affected thousands, if not millions, in a way that the trauma that they face is not something that anyone deserves to face. So I did want to add that, but sorry for interrupting. And it happened right in our neighborhood. Care, Georgia is down the street from there. The masjid we go to for afternoon prayers is down the street. And our former executive director, Edward Mitchell, now deputy director of Care National, we stopped at that Wendy's as very much so our community where we've worshiped and where we've worked in. And I know Project South feels the same way, that this is an attack upon our community and the people of our community.
That's right. No, I appreciate that too. That was appropriate to lift up. And it's so real because first and foremost, we all can imagine, or at least try to imagine what this brother's family is going through right now. And just the heartache and the rage and the grief, all I'm sure together that they're feeling. And so lifting that up is very appropriate. A lot of the work that Project South does as well is not only the neighborhood organizing work, but we're very much a regional organization. We're called Project South, Institute for the Elimination of Poverty and Genocide. And that's because we really believe that the US South as a region is a very important region for the entire country. And W.E.B. Du Bois said at the turn of the century, this past century, the 1900s, as the South goes, so goes the nation. And what he really meant is the type of attacks that happen in the South often are exported across the country, but also a lot of the gains, a lot of the movement victories that we have also have a big impact on the nation itself. And so in addition to our neighborhood organizing work, we have a lot of projects and programs to build what we consider social movement power from the bottom up. We believe that social movements are really the best vehicle to create the type of changes we need to see in our community. And so I won't go into all the detail of those programs, but definitely would love if there's any questions about more of the work we do, or you can also always, check us out online or stop by. I know that we're in a time of global pandemic, and so we're all trying to protect and promote the public health, and physical distance is a big part of that. But our building is a community center, and it's for the community, and it's open to any of you all to find out more information about what we do.
Thank you for sharing that. And I can really just echo, Project South does incredible work with the community. They're really a community-driven and community-led organization that focuses on the community's needs and empowering the community to take control and take ownership and have autonomy over their movements. They're not a group that puts their values or views upon anyone else. It's very much community-driven. And you've brought up an interesting point, I think, is that the South, especially in America, is a very specific region. And I think a lot of what people don't understand about policing is that policing in the South, they don't understand the history of it. So the policing in the South started off as slave patrol. This is the first form of policing. And then it went into affecting or into promoting Jim Crow. Then it went to affecting segregation and promoting segregation. But the system of policing is a racist system. One of the things that we've talked about within CARE is that when we hear white activists talk about the criminal justice system, a lot of times we hear them say it's a broken criminal justice system. And when we hear Black activists talk about it, they say this isn't just the system isn't broken; it's working exactly as it was intended to do, and it was intended to incarcerate at a disproportionate rate people of color, particularly Black men and women. So with that history and with that understanding, can you just explain a little bit about the abolition movement, the abolishment of police departments? Where does this come from? What are the origins of this movement, and what does it mean? I know these are broad questions, but our viewers are very interested in this. And for those who are joining us, thank you for joining us. Put in the chat where you're joining us from, whether it's in Atlanta, another part of Georgia, another part of the country. Let us know if you have questions. Please put them in the chat too. I'll try my best to ask all of them. We are monitoring the chat, so please, we welcome you and we want to hear from you.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. The roots of policing in this country certainly were formed around the horrible period of the transatlantic slave trade and of chattel slavery, and so slave patrols, whose purpose was to arrest what they considered fugitive slaves, and but were really humans trying to live a life like we all are, and escape the horrible conditions of enslavement, and bring them back to the plantation. And that's literally where one of the major roots of policing in this country comes from. Another root is really to develop a force that could contend with other sort of movements, including the labor movement right here in the South. One of the first times the federal government paid a private police agency was actually in the 1800s, and it was the Pinkertons, which was one of the first private police groups here in the US, and it was really to put down a multiracial union uprising that was happening in horrible conditions there. And so the roots of policing is not to protect us, or not to even create law and order, as is often said. It's really for social control, and that's where it's always been. And there's been no period of US history where that form of social control, where policing has not been brutally violent within the Black community, and in many other communities as well. As we all know, after September 11th, 2001, there was a whole set of forces that created what we really consider to be institutional Islamophobia. And so, along with institutional racism directed at African Americans and Black people in general, there's also now a series of laws and policies, media conglomerates, law enforcement, and all sorts of institutions working together to really promote the what I consider racist ideology of Islamophobia. And so that could be said, the same history of how policing has impacted a lot of our communities across this country. There's plenty of examples. So for Project South, it's not about reforming a broken system. And I think you're right to point out as well that it's not a broken system. This is a system that's operating for the purpose that it was born to operate from, and it's actually working well. And our job as people who believe in human rights, who believe in human dignity, who believe in democratic participation, is not to try to fix something or make it less brutal than it is, but really to abolish it and recreate an entire new ecosystem that deals with some of the problems that we now are sort of taught to believe can only be dealt with through policing.
Thank you for that very thorough answer into sort of the history of policing, and not just in the South, throughout the country. and privatized policing and paid police forces, and why sort of Project South has this abolition stance. I think that's really important to emphasize. And just to get a little bit more clarity then, um, when we hear the term defund the police, from my understanding, and you would have a better understanding of this, there's about 2 or 3 different camps. Sometimes when people say defund the police in today's day and age, it means defund the police by taking away some of their resources, taking away some of the amount that you put into them and reinvesting that money. Other times when people say defund the police, they mean completely abolishing the police department and dismantling the police department. So there are these 2 different perspectives. I want to focus more so on the abolition standpoint. Why is it dangerous for people, for advocates, for civil rights activists, or even just for the general population to say defund the police if they mean the former, which is reinvesting large portions of the police budget into something else, but not completely dismantling them? And on a broader policy scale, why, and I think you've touched upon this, but just to reemphasize, why can reform not fix the police departments? Why do we need to abolish them?
That's right. Yeah, I think this defund the police phrase has really the most important aspects of that phrase, I think, have emerged from these street protests we've seen over the last couple weeks, where it's really caught on. I'm sure we've all seen the images of huge banners of where people are saying defund the police. And I think for the young people and all the folks out there doing these protests day after day, the term really is related to, as you stated, abolition. But as these things go, very quickly, these terms can be sort of co-opted and used for a different purpose. And so we've seen so many examples over the last week or 2 weeks where this defund the police is really being co-opted into a police reform agenda. And again, reforming the police is trying to fix something that is not broken. It's really working as it was meant to. And really, a lot of people will say, well, what would happen to all the problems in our society that exist if there was no police? And I think people who ask that question are imagining a society as violent as the current society that we live in, but just without police. And for those of us who are advocating to abolish the police, we're actually, it's a broad demand that would include so many different strategies, and so much different change would have to be wrapped up in this abolition. We would have to deal with a lot of the root causes that cause crime and violence. That means dealing with poverty. That means dealing with a broken healthcare system. That means dealing with a broken education system. Abolishing the police is really a helpful vision to keep our eyes on, because then it allows us to see all these other changes that would need to happen to realize this abolition goal. And I want to say in the same breath that I've learned from some of my elders to be careful to not imagine that these type of changes are going to take. Sometimes we hear, well, it's not going to happen in my lifetime, but we just got to work towards it. Well, for folks, I'm 43 years old, but for folks who are older than me, you probably remember some things that seemed unimaginable in your childhood that now are commonplace. And that's true. That's always going to be the case. So although it seems completely unrealistic to some, how could we abolish the police? Sweeping changes are not only possible, they're guaranteed. They always happen throughout history. And so the real question, I think, for those of us who are participating in this conversation tonight is, which side of history do we want to be on? We are seeing some sweeping changes, not only in this country, but across the world right now. We are going to be entering into these changes are going to lead to some really fundamental paradigm shifts in our society. And so we have to ask ourselves, which side are we on? Are we on the side that's going to try to hold on to a past that was never really working for most people? Or are we going to be on the side of really fundamental change, of transformation? And that doesn't have to be in the next generation. That could be in our lifetime. So although abolishing the police is, yes, it's complicated, it will involve making a lot of changes in how our society and how our communities work. It is possible, and it's possible in our lifetime.
I want to thank you for that answer, because I think one of the things you touched upon is really powerful to me, and I'm sure for a lot of our viewers. We've had people from Kennesaw, Atlanta. I'm looking at some of the comments that are coming in, very appreciative of the work that Project South does. Is that we have to dare to dream if we're going to do something, accomplish anything. And I also want to say, CARE National is, along with all their chapters, are working right now. They have an anti-Black, or addressing anti-Black racism committee, and a subcommittee and a task force that is working on creating policy positions within CARE itself. One of these is addressing the abolition versus reformist position. And so while that decision hasn't been decided yet by CARE National, I think I can speak to the principle of daring to dream about transformational change. That's something that you have to desire something, you have to strive for something to ever achieve something. There was a time, for all necessary like foreign policies or surveillance issues people may have had with President Obama, there was a time in this country not very long ago, no one would have dreamed a Black man would have been president. Yeah. And absolutely, Mitch McConnell is not reparations for slavery, I can tell you that, but a Black man became president. My niece and nephew were raised for the first 8 years of their lives only seeing a Black man as president of the United States. That means something. Definitely. And it's only because people aspired to have that transformational change that things like that could occur. Abolishing the police or any type of those considered radical reforms, when you say something's radical, you almost make it impossible. So I don't like using that term, but I think the point is we should have this, we should strive for transformational change if it's something we truly believe in, whether it's because of our religious convictions or moral convictions or our understanding of the socio-political and economic realities of living in America. For whatever reason, if there's something that we believe in so strongly, we shouldn't choose to go for incremental change because we believe that's how it has to occur. Because Emery, like you said, transformational change has happened throughout history. That's where we've seen changes. Slavery, there was the Emancipation Proclamation. Didn't mean it ended slavery right then, but the position was official that slaves in the South, not the North, slaves in the South were freed. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is another thing we touched on. Brown v. Board of Education. It may have took incremental steps then to enforce these decisions, but these were sweeping changes. And while it took years to implement them properly, it was fundamentally different than how it was before, and it happened very quickly. So I think that's a very important point for us to stress. We need to dare to dream. One of the things we've talked about, and reformists talk about this too, is reduced funding and reallocating this funding. And I think abolitionists and the reformists, they come together here, and the number of percentages might be off, but you're reallocating resources. So resources that may have originally gone to the police department, you're now reallocating to other groups. Within CARE, we've advocated for these going into community-led, community-driven, and community-inspired and manned operations that serve public safety and health. But can you talk a little bit about what these programs would be, what type of things we can reallocate these resources into, and what effect that would have on public safety, and what effect and how that would be an alternative to policing?
Definitely. I was reflecting on what I was going to say today, and thinking about an early memory that I had as a child. And I was visiting some family in Washington, D.C., and we were out to pick up some takeout food and bring it back to the family. and I was with my dad, and the store right next to this takeout restaurant was one of these urban sort of food markets, and I must have been about 8 years old, and I saw somebody come out and be accosted by the police, and they pulled up his shirt, and he had meat that he had stolen from the store under the shirt. And I was a young child, but I remember watching this man forced to the ground and then beaten in front of my eyes. And as a child, I just couldn't add that up. The question was, well, why did he have meat? And the answer that my parents told me, which was obvious, was, he was hungry, and he was in there. And stealing, all of us know and have been taught that stealing is not a good thing. And there are hungry people who are in a position where they have to make difficult choices. How do you deal with that as a society? Do you attack and beat up that person, put them in handcuffs, bruised and brutalized, and take them off to jail? What kind of change does that bring about? Or do you not condone stealing, but try to figure out what the root cause of that situation is? Marion Kaba, you asked earlier about who some of the history of abolition, and somebody I cite all the time and has an article that was actually just published as an opinion piece in the New York Times called "Yes, We Mean Literally Abolish the Police." And in that article, she puts in a concept, and I've heard her say this before, about community care workers. We could have a whole new job training program to train. We have a jobless problem, but we could start a new deal around training our young people to be community care workers that could still come in, resolve situations, but also try to get to the root cause. A lot of what policing gets involved with are really social service problems. And so if we did, instead of spending all this money on policing, spent it on even social service programs that could prevent these types of problems from even happening in the first place. So that's one piece, is I just think we could retool our society and refund what's important to us, and solving the root cause of violence, of crime, and of any of the issues that many people understandably say, well, what would happen if there was no police to theft? What would happen if there was no police if I'm physically accosted? All these situations, for those of us who believe in abolition, we believe in creating a society where these problems aren't as commonplace as they are today. Everybody knows this country has an obsession with guns. That is a problem. And the police are one of the biggest reflections of that problem we could ever see. To see some of the military looking hardware that they walk around with is incredible, and it's not necessary. Those of us with global experience who are a little bit older probably remember in the 90s, even as recent as the 1990s, most police officers in the United Kingdom weren't allowed to carry firearms. This is not a long time ago. This was pre-September 11th, but that's, again, we're so accustomed and we're taught to believe that everything we see around us is just the way that it is. But change is always happening, and it's always possible. And we really want to be in a place where we're with these young people protesting on the street, but also thinking with them about how can we implement some long-term, really fundamental changes that includes this vision of abolition.
Thank you. I think that's a great segue. I mean, we're getting a lot of comments and questions, so I just want to touch upon a few of them. We have a comment that says, yes, if the state cannot provide food and welfare, it cannot punish people for stealing. We have another comment that says it's proven that punishment solves nothing, and that if we don't get to the root of the problems, they can persist. We've also shared this article on our link. For those viewers, it's on the Facebook Live link. You can click on yes, we actually mean abolish the police to read more about this topic. But I want to address these comments and also your observations just now. The story is very telling. There's this man who's hungry and has to steal to eat, to survive, not to thrive, but to survive. So I think there's a lot that we take for granted in this country growing up that American society takes for granted. One of those things being is that a welfare state is undesirable for whatever reason. Once we start talking about putting social welfare institutions in place, there's always talk and pushback about how do we curtail them. We have welfare to work. You can only be on welfare for 26 weeks or 13 weeks, or depends on what it is on the state. You have to be actively looking for work. And the issue is, I think people don't look at this from an open mind where it's not just to thrive. Forget about thriving. This is to survive. You are putting these restrictions on people. There's no access to affordable healthcare. There's no guaranteed access to post-secondary education or to affordable childcare. You have water and utility shutoffs. A lot of these things, there were moratoriums placed on them during this time of pandemic, but not in every municipality at all. But why are these things that we allow in the long run? And I think abolishing the police, or even addressing these alternatives to police alternatives, comes under the same vein. It's so opposite of what people take for granted here. There's this initial shock, but once we start diving into it, it seems to make a lot more sense. Social welfare institutions are incredibly important for a population. We know that from the communities we serve. The people that are most marginalized are also the ones that are the most heavily policed. Representative Ocasio-Cortez had a comment recently, and I don't fully support, but I think it was a poignant point that what would a place look like if you abolish the police? She said it would look like a suburb, where there are institutions that are in place to protect the community and that are community led and driven, and they're not being policed for petty offenses. So I think that those are important points that you touched upon and that we also touched upon. One of the questions we got though, so Project South is a big proponent, I think abolitionists in general are big proponents of putting in these community service programs and community service resources that will curtail crime and that will definitely actually work on addressing crime and making it so that they don't occur. One of the questions we got is, what are alternatives to policing when a violent crime is occurring? Who do you call as a police alternative to someone if your house is being robbed? Who would you call in that moment? Or if you're being attacked in the street, let's say it happens more rarely, but once that happens, if there's not a police department to call, who do you call?
I think it's a great question. And I think that there are certainly people who've been thinking a lot about these questions of abolition, who there's different ways to answer that question. I also just wanted to, for folks who are in the chat or online, to look up Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and she is a longtime abolitionist and also has a recent podcast that was on The Intercept that outlines some of the framework around abolition.
And we're going to share that in the chat so people can have access to that as well.
Great. It's a great piece, and just came out recently, given these uprisings. So, I think that my honest answer is we don't know, because we are just now beginning as a country to take this question of abolition seriously. We need to create the new reality. Will it be community care workers? Will it be other community-based solutions? There are examples to look to globally of how crime is dealt with in different parts of the world. It's of course not all the same as it is here. The U.S. Incarcerates more people than the rest of the world combined. And so um, we are really in the midst of the most acute sort of policing violent place in the world when it comes to these questions of the prison system and of the police system. So it's very hard for us to imagine what would we do. I do think that we would have to have accountability. We are not talking about a situation where injustices go unresolved. There are frameworks we've put into practice at Project South in our community work, and we've put into practice to various extents in our regional work, such as restorative justice. When harm or an injury happens, like let's go back to this theft of the meat situation where somebody was hungry. The store owner, they might be from the community too, and they're saying, look, I'm barely making enough for my family to survive, and I can't have people coming in here taking stuff. Well, harm was caused to her, let's say. Everybody who was harmed by that situation, us as a family having to watch this brutality take place, we were harmed in that situation. Well, restorative justice says we need a practice where we can bring together all the people that were harmed by a situation and come to agreement what would be the best solution. We've we've seen examples where this has been employed, where even in cases of murder, people have been able to come together and find an agreed upon solution to, and that's the most extreme example that you can imagine of an injustice.
And I want to echo that. I worked for a year with the capital defenders, and we're working on capital punishment cases. And capital punishment has a variety of issues, both procedural and evidentiary. But one of the biggest things, or one of the things that we would cite on a routine basis is, particularly in the sentencing phase, is the victims' families very rarely feel any sense of justice or any sense of fulfillment with a death sentence. The rate of highest, feeling of satisfaction or justice that the victim's family would get is when they would sit down with the perpetrator and actually have that reconciliation there. So I think restorative justice, this is the most extreme example of restorative justice that you can think of. This is someone sitting down with the perpetrator of killing one of their loved ones, one of their family members. And if it can work in that situation, their restorative justice as a principle can work in others. There are complications there, but even, and I want to let you finish, Emery, but one last thing I want to touch upon is, technically, we live in a rehabilitative justice system. Technically, incarceration is a form of rehabilitation. And I think for the most part, we can see the errors there. And Emery, I want you to touch upon that as well, because you are going in great depth about restorative justice, which I think is really important. And also just touch upon the problems with rehabilitative justice, especially when it's dealing with incarceration as the vehicle for rehabilitation.
That's right. Yeah, I think that it's great to hear that story too about your own experience with that need, that human need to resolve situations, not sweep it under the rug or not lock it away in a place where you don't have to see it anymore, but to resolve situations. And we are living in a society that is not resolving problems, it's perpetuating problems. And so I think at its core, restorative justice is about actual resolution and actual justice. Nobody that I've ever met in the abolition movement is we're social justice practitioners. We've dedicated our lives to social justice. So we're not advocating for a reality where justices go unaddressed, injustice goes unaddressed. It's quite the opposite. And also, just because you mentioned it, prison. I spent about 6 years teaching a Black Studies course in a jail that was really almost like a de facto prison, and because of the amount of time people were incarcerated there. And after, very quickly, I remember thinking, I was pretty young too, in my early 20s, and I remember thinking, anybody I know who even just spent an evening in this prison would know that it is not set up for success. It is one of the most awful environments I've ever witnessed or could even imagine. Inside these jails, there's no rehabilitation happening. It's the opposite. It's a inhuman environment that sort of advocates and encourages inhuman behavior, and not necessarily by the inmates, but by the guards themselves. So we've set up these systems but we don't see it. Most people don't go inside a jail, and there's a big wall to prevent that from happening. So a lot of the problems that we're experiencing are problems that are being hidden away, and I think if most people had to see the inside of a prison, the prison abolition movement would be stronger, because it's insanity what's happening inside these prison walls. And most people who have go to the Atlanta Municipal Traffic Court and just spend a morning watching what happens just in traffic court, and the amount of injustices you'll see in a morning, the racial disparities, the way that class is dealt with is just mind-boggling. And so we really need to, and I think being a part of this conversation tonight is a step towards it. We need to unearth the real root cause of the problems we're dealing with, and be a part of together making changes to those problems.
Absolutely. And we're getting some more comments, so I'm going to go through them as well. And I just want to encourage all our viewers, please do put in your comments and your questions. We have our incredible communications director working overtime on sending these over to us. So we are following along. Please do include your comments. We do want to address them. So there are a few things that I think we're getting from the audience. So one of them, and I think this is what I was touching upon earlier, where we have this idea of social welfare institutions being discouraged or disfavored by Americans for whatever reason, just typically. Obviously, there's been a shift recently. But the largest recipient of welfare in this country is the wealthy, is in the form of corporate subsidies and tax breaks for the wealthy and other legislative actions. And at no point is that seen in the same lens. We understand that to be an economic decision. And I am concerned about why that same application isn't given when we talk about social institutions and social welfare institutions being provided for those that are most marginalized. If we're increasing standard of living, if we're increasing the purchasing power, if we're increasing the bare necessities, or allowing people to get the bare necessities of what they need, at a much larger scale in terms of number of people, why that economic argument isn't made there. It shouldn't be an economic argument, but even when it is, why that isn't made. Because at this point, we have a system, and I think this is going to be difficult for us to touch upon, where the very many who are either middle class or lower class economically, I don't like talking about classes, but just in the economic scale, are funding and are giving tax breaks and subsidies to the very wealthy. And again, I think that's by design. There's always another comment touched upon the tyranny of inherited wealth. And then the follow-up was, this is the question. I'm absolutely in agreement with abolition and getting to the root of problems. I've been something of a student of restorative justice since 2006. How do we get things to move more quickly? And Emery, I'm going to let you answer this, but I just want to say that Project South has been doing this work for 30 years. Because of very unfortunate circumstances, and it's not at all, it should not have taken the deaths of Black men and women that's been going on for 400 years, but these most recent deaths, it should not have taken this to move along a national argument, national conversation. But because of those deaths, we've seen this advance. But it's because of the work of groups like Project South and a lot of other groups that have worked in this space for a lot longer. So I'm going to let Emery go into how we can get things to move a little bit more quickly now. There was one last point with that question, which said, is it technically, is rehabilitation or is incarceration technically rehabilitative or ostensibly? And I mean, it is ostensibly, but it just by definition is what I meant. But you're right to say there's nothing rehabilitative about locking someone. Emery, but I'm going to let you go into how we get things to move around more quickly of restorative justice.
Definitely. I think it's a great question, and it's definitely a question I ask myself from time to time as well. Because for those of us who can see the vision of the changes we want to see, we want to get there as quickly as possible because of all the pain and suffering of this current society. Um, I'm really encouraged by what's happened over the last few weeks. I think that, to me, it indicates the potential for some pretty fundamental changes to happen more quickly than I would have even imagined a month ago. The sometimes when change happens in society, it's like, to me, like a coming together of historical forces that you can't make that happen, but when it happens, we can recognize that it's happening. And I remember after September 11th, seeing pictures on September 12th of Palestinians holding U.S. flags in solidarity of, from a human level, the massive loss of life that happened on September 11th. And to me, there was what that indicated. It wasn't about the U.S. flags, but it was about a group that has been really, really, really oppressed and exploited and under apartheid, in part because of U.S. foreign policy, saying, even though all of that is the case and we know all of that is true, because this horrible thing has happened, there's a door opening to let's talk, let's recreate society. And I think those moments, they come and they go. Unfortunately, the very next day, George W. Bush came out and said there's going to be a global war on terror and we're going to hunt them down and all this madness. And it really killed that moment, a moment where I think a lot of the world was like, even though all the messed up things U.S. foreign policy is doing right now, let's be together on some fundamental questions about life and survival. And I bring that up because we're in one of those moments right now, because of what the courage of these young people to go out to face off with the police, who are ironically, or maybe not ironically, but who are brutalizing these protesters on a daily basis for protesting police brutality. They're going out there day after day. They are creating an opening that we can all be a part of. And that's how we get things moving more quickly. When these type of moments happen, we need to stop. We need to think about what we can do differently, and join with these forces of change. Because although I believe a dam has burst globally, I mean, when you see statues of King Leopold being taken down in Antwerp that have been up there since the days of when he killed 10 million Congolese people, these are big changes. They're not just symbolic changes. A dam has burst. That can't be put back in, but that huge river of change that's coming out can be diverted. And that's what the powers that be are going to try to do. There are people who benefit from the status quo. That's why change doesn't happen, because they're benefiting and they're trying to stop change from happening. But for most people, this current status quo is not benefiting us fully, and so or at all. And so for those of us who believe, who want to see a better life for ourselves, for our communities, for our families, for our society, we need to stop in this moment. We are in a moment of potential great change, and say, what can I do differently? How could I join with this energy in a way that I never have before? I just got a call last night of somebody who's starting a new fund called Brown for Black, where South Asians are trying to pool together resources to give to Black-led organizations. That's huge. That's different. I've never heard of that happening before. And so we are in a moment of major change where we can all take steps and be a part of the change and help ensure that this great bursting of the dam does not get diverted back into the status quo, but that we really take this opportunity to make some fundamental changes happen.
And with that, I want to talk about a few of the specifics that we have. I'm loath to call it an opportunity because I don't believe that a person's death should be seen in this lens. But it's no question that Rayshard Brooks has changed the world. His death has changed the world. The city of Atlanta was given demands in a letter by Project South. Could you talk, and including dismantling the Atlanta Police Department within 5 and 7 years, allocating funding into communities from cages, releasing or I think taking away Atlanta Detention Center, releasing those releasing those held in custody, particularly those who are vulnerable to COVID-19. Why is this the time to ask for those demands? And how do you feel about why those demands specifically? Why the demand to dismantle within 5 to 7 years? Why the demand to to demolish the detention center? And then with honor again to Brother Rayshard, because it was a tragedy what happened. And while we are navigating the space, I will forever be an advocate that we need to hold existing institutions accountable for their misdeeds and for their abuses of power. Even if we're moving towards radical reform or abolition, we still need to hold these existing institutions accountable in lieu of that in the meantime.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I just fully agree, and I think continuing to lift up what the Brooks family is going through right now is critically important, because although I've been talking about how we change society and that's what we definitely need to do, we can't forget the concrete and specific reality of this specific murder that happened, and for those who watched the video, just senseless murder of a young man and a parent and a brother and a person connected to a whole community of people that are now just mourning and grieving his loss. So as it relates to those specific demands, I think it's a good example of what we're up against. We're here in the city of Atlanta, and we've been Project South working in collaboration with partner organizations. We're a part of a big campaign to shut down the Atlanta Detention Center because of its gross human rights violations. That work also poured into work of a coalition that we are also a part of that is trying to dismantle the Atlanta jail and have it transformed into a community service space. And the mayor was, apparently on board with that idea. Now, I don't know, why she was saying she was on board with that idea at a certain point, but from what we heard, she was on board with this idea. But we're not the only person pushing for an agenda at the mayor's office. There's other people that are very powerful in this city and in this state that were pushing for the other thing. No, keep the jail open. And so we found out that there was $18 million budgeted to keep this jail open, and the mayor switched her position. So now we're part of this coalition, and there are other organizations that are playing a huge leadership role in this coalition that we're just a part of, and that's reflected in the demands, because some of the demands, I think, at this point, we should ask for as much as we can potentially imagine. So immediate shutdown of the jail would be if I was just making Emory's demand to the mayor, but we're part of a coalition. And so we have to, work together and find agreement on those demands. But I think I bring that up also because we are, for all the good work that's happening on the streets, all the good work that's happening in sister organizations like Southerners on New Ground, or Black Youth Project 100, or the Racial Justice Action Center. Those are some of the groups also part of this coalition, really playing a leadership role in this coalition. We're fighting for what we're fighting for, but we're also up against very powerful forces that don't want to see these changes happen. And so that's why we need each other, and we need everybody who's on this call to join one of these organizations. Join Care Georgia, join Project South, join Song, join all of the many grassroots organizations, statewide organizations who are committing to really being a part of this change that's happening in society. And so, yeah, that would be my answer to that question. But the shutting down of the jail is just one step. We are living in a state with some of the most horrendous detention centers in the country, detaining immigrants. We are there are this question of abolition, again, is a broad question that encompasses a lot of different things that need to be dismantled, reimagined, and that's what we're about in this coalition, and that's what we're about in all of our work.
Thank you so much for that, Emery. I want to end on, I want to thank all our viewers for joining us for this incredibly important and poignant discussion. I want to give you the opportunity here, though, if you could put one thing on a billboard, if you could have one message to the world about this topic, what would it be?
It's a great question. I mean, I think another world is possible, and we need to build it together. And you know, this is not, so that would be my statement. We are what exists right now is not the way that it needs to be. We do not need to have domestic policies that lead to hunger and homelessness. We do not need to have domestic policies that lead to communities being broken apart by ICE. We do not need to have a situation where the U.S. government is spying on people in their houses of worship. All of this, these are all things that are happening, but these are all things that need to change. And so another world is possible. These young people are out on the streets, making it more possible than it's ever been in my lifetime. And now is the time for all of us to join with this energy, be a part of this sweeping change, not only in this country, but again, globally. Most of us know the politicians aren't going to make the change, the corporations aren't going to make the change. It's going to be everyday people coming together in social movements, figuring out democratic decision making and how we come together across difference to make the changes from the bottom up we know are possible.
Thank you for that. And again, Emery Wright, co-director of Project South, thank you so much for joining us. We're very honored to have your presence here and your thoughts and your perspectives, and you really being an expert in this field to talk us through what abolition means and talk to us really in depth about the abolition movement. So thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to having you here with us again in the future.
Thank you so much, Murtaza, and thank you so much, Care Georgia, and thank you all for all of y'all tuning in. I can tell from the comments we're together, and we need to be stronger together as we make all these changes possible. So thank you. Let's abolish the police.
Thank you for everyone joining us. To all our viewers, this has been, again, an incredibly important discussion. It doesn't need to end now. So please, if you have comments, comment on the thread. It'll be live. This video is going to stay up on the post. And beyond that, reach out to Care Georgia, reach out to Project South, get involved in these organizations. They're doing great work. And I know that firsthand for both organizations. Thank you again for joining us. Hope you're all staying safe with your families. and we'll be in touch again soon. Thank you for joining for Care for a Conversation. Take care.